Okay, so Pastor Dave gave me this passage from Jeremiah 29 to preach on, and the theme of resilience. This comes as the third of a series on soul rest, after lament last week and beauty from brokenness the week before. Resilience is an important topic in any day, I guess. At any time there'll be people in the church dealing with all kinds of issues and problems and troubles. Perhaps particularly now with COVID, many people have experienced difficulties with lockdown, and nationally mental health concerns have been increasing. So it's good that we talk about these things, both for ourselves and so that we can help others. And yet I feel a bit of a fraud to talk about resilience. Yes, I've been affected by COVID like everyone, but I haven't needed the sort of resilience that some people have. My life's been easier than many people. There are people in this congregation who've had to face much greater things than I have. People in this congregation who've been uprooted from their homelands and had to live in the UK. People with long-term health issues. So I don't want to base this sermon, it's not about me and my experience, and say, be resilient like I am. It's not based on what the textbook says, but I want to look at Jeremiah and his message to the people of Judah and what we can learn from that. And if there's someone in the congregation who you have your own testimony of resilience in your own life that you could share with us, then we'd like to hear that. And do send it in. Talk to people in the church, talk to people in a life group, email us in, come talk to one of the leaders. We can all be blessed by each other, even in the experiences that have required resilience. Jeremiah was certainly someone who needed resilience himself. It was a very difficult life being a prophet. His message was not welcome at all. He was telling the people that they had abandoned their covenant with God, and that they were going to be sent into exile. They didn't want to hear that, and he was persecuted himself for it. So he needed resilience himself. He had something to share. So I want to talk a little bit about the context of this passage. When was it set, and why was it written? Jeremiah himself lived from about 650 to 570 BC. He spanned the reign of 5 kings of Judah, some of them who were very short. Before his time, the northern tribes of Israel had already been invaded by the Assyrians, and they'd been taken into exile. And Judah was now living as really a vassal state, dominated by the Babylonians. I have a map. You can see it's quite small, actually. Can you see the tiny little place where Judah is on that compared to the size of the Babylonian Empire to the north and east of it? And Judah's really squeezed between Egypt to the south and Babylonia to the north. The Babylonians had laid siege to Jerusalem twice. The first time in 597 BC, where they'd taken a wave of people into exile and left a puppet king in place. That was Zedekiah. And even he rebelled, so they came back in 587 BC, and then they completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, knocked down the walls, and took the rest of the people into exile. So that's the times that Jeremiah is writing into. So it was a hard time for them. They've lost their existence as a country. They've lost their government, their king. Their capital city is captured. Their temple has been destroyed, which is the center of their worship. And they're taken to another country where they feel like foreigners in a strange land. Those people needed resilience. So if you were Jeremiah, what would you say? What would your message be to encourage the people living in exile in Babylon? And just to put this another way, we discussed in my life group a little while back, many of us, we feel like strangers in a strange land. Just here, even if we were born in England, we feel that the values of our society are different from God's values. We feel that some of the things that people do and what we see on television is so different, and we feel like we don't really belong here. And that's perhaps because we really want to be with God. But we're here where we are. And so what can we learn about how to be resilient in our situation from Jeremiah? So the first thing he says to them is, make the best of their situation. In verse 5, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, and do not decrease, and seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. So he's saying, have faith that God will be at work in your situation, and meanwhile, carry on the normal activities of life. Look to the future patiently, and build houses, plant gardens, marry and have children and grandchildren. He's saying to be resilient, don't withdraw into despair, but live like you have a future. He's encouraging them to have acceptance of their situation, not to be in denial, but to make the best of it. They have lost their homes, they have lost their farms, they have to start again. But he's saying face that, accept the situation, and do it rather than denying it. Resilience requires that. It means acceptance of the situation. So I find you an example. This is Steph Reed. She was always a sporty person. She wanted to be a professional sports person from when she was very young. She wanted to be a runner and a long jumper. You notice anything about her? As a teenager, she was in a boating accident and her foot had to be amputated. So she has a prosthetic right foot. But she went into sport. She became a Paralympic runner and long jumper and has been world champion and world record holder. She also holds an honours degree in biochemistry, as it happens. So she's making the best of her situation. What can we do in our day with the issues and problems that we have to make the best of our current situation? That's the question for us. Jeremiah's also saying, make the best of your relationship to the people around you, even the Babylonians. He wrote, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. He could have said, the Babylonians are to blame, just look after yourselves, keep to yourselves, and don't do anything to help them. But instead, he encourages them to pray and actively seek the prosperity of their neighbours. The word in Hebrew there for peace and prosperity is shalom. It's a deep word in Hebrew, which has a meaning translated as peace and prosperity here. Seek the shalom of the city that you're in and your neighbours. To me, this verse is quite reminiscent of where Jesus says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's good if we can have positive relationships with those around us, even if they're different from us, even if they're our enemy. It will be better for them and better for us. Resilience is not built on hatred or vengeance. That doesn't lead to resilience. It's love that does. Note he is not saying become like the Babylonians. He's not saying worship the gods of the Babylonians, but he's saying bless them and pray for their shalom. So what can we do in our situation today to seek the peace and prosperity of the city around us and pray for it? Next, Jeremiah says, in effect, don't wait until the situation is different. God is not saying, wait until the Babylonians, wait until you leave Babylon and go back to Judah, and then things will be better. Then it will be time for you to live positively. He's saying, do it now. Build houses now, plant gardens now, marry and have children where you are. Don't put your life on hold. Don't wait until the situation is different. You may not know how long you would be waiting for. In fact, the people of Judah had to wait 70 years. God did eventually bring them out of Babylon, as he promised he would, and took them back to their land. But they had to wait for it. In fact, it was mostly their children, or perhaps their grandchildren, who God brought out. So it means we do look to the future, but we don't wait for it without living in the present. To be resilient, we live in the moment now, with hope for the future. Are we waiting for something to change, or are we living for God now in our situation, making the best of it? Sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. Looking at the future and living in the present is certainly better than looking back to the past with regret. If we're looking back and saying, oh, it was better when we were in Judah, in our homeland, and being unhappy about that, that doesn't help with resilience. What we need to do is look to the possibilities now, live in hope for the future, and then make the most of the present. Looking at the past can be a way of avoiding the present. To be resilient, we need acceptance of the situation as it is. Acceptance is to say, we're in Babylon, not in Judah, so what can we do positively here and now? Are we living in the present or in the past? Next up, have a purpose. Steph Reed had a purpose. Her purpose was to become a Paralympian. So that's what led to her training, to getting fit, to being able to compete. Having a purpose is a positive thing. Don't do nothing and bemoan the situation. Jeremiah is saying, have a purpose, build houses and plant crops, marry and have children. It's not the same as it was. And God is saying, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. That's the word shalom again, to prosper you. Just in secular terms, any purpose is better than having no purpose. But for us as God's people, we should look for God's purpose. We should listen to God and align ourselves with what his purpose is for us. God is teaching the exiles to be faithful to him, not to worship other gods, not to rely on their own strength, in their case on Egypt, but to rely on him, to renew their covenant with him. And the sooner they learnt that, the sooner they understood it and lived by it, the better. In our own situation in the 21st century, we should be looking to God's purposes for us today. What is your purpose? Ooh, I went past that. Hope is vitally important. We read that God says, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a hope and a future. They have a hope which is not just wishful thinking, but it's based on the promise of God. The Lord declares later on in verse 14, I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I've banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Now, to be resilient, we should have a hope, but a hope that's based on God's promises to us. If they just look at the situation that they're in exile, they won't have the hope that God promises. But their hope is based on the fact that God is faithful, on the character of God, on the fact that he fulfills his promises. Conversely, being without hope is a killer. People who have no hope are not going to thrive. So what's the hope that you have in your minds today? What plan and promises of God are you thinking about and depending on? There's a danger, however, of a false hope. And there was a false hope in Jeremiah's day. The chapter before this, chapter 28, there's a false prophet called Hananiah who's been saying, God will bring the exiles back to Judah in 2 years. And that was a lie. It was not true. God had not told him to say that. He was saying what they would have liked to hear. If the people had believed Hananiah with that false hope, what would have happened? They wouldn't have settled down. They wouldn't have built houses and planted gardens. They would have been unsettled, and they'd have been disappointed after 2 years when it didn't happen. I was reading in this book by Patrick Regan, which I recommend if anyone's interested in reading more about resilience. He talks about someone who is a prisoner in a POW camp. Some people in the camp survived and made it out, and some people didn't. What was it that made the difference? And Patrick writes that this prisoner of war decided to be positive. The people who didn't survive were those who gave themselves a false hope. They said, we'll be out by Christmas, and then Christmas comes and goes, and they're not out, and that crushes the spirit. It's important to face the difficult facts, and sometimes the timing is not what we might wish for. So have hope, but not a false hope. What actually Jeremiah says to them is, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise. We have to wait for God's timing. Sometimes God's timing is quick, and sometimes we have to wait patiently. Let us accept God's timing and not make up a false hope. Are we prepared to accept God's timing? The people need to put their faith actively in what God says. God is making them a promise, but they need to actively believe it and put their trust in that as a positive action. Jeremiah is saying in this passage, put your faith into it, do those things like building houses, planting gardens, marrying. It's a practical, faith is a practical thing. If we just claim to have faith without practice, faith without practice is dead. Conversely, before the exile, many of them had not put their faith in God. They put their faith in their own strength, their soldiers, their city walls would withstand a siege, put their faith in Egypt to rescue them, rather than in God. Here in exile, in Babylon, all that was taken away, and they had to learn to have faith in God. Is God saying to us in these COVID times that we've put our trust in the wrong things, and we need to put our trust in Him? What are we doing in our day to build our faith in God and to put it into practice? Gone too far. And lastly, to be resilient, maintain your worship and your relationship with God. It would have been easy for the people to mingle in with the Babylonians and to adopt their religion and worship the gods and the idols of the people around them. And probably some of them did. Those people would have been lost when the exiles were brought back from Babylon to Judah 70 years later. But some of them maintained their worship and their relationship with God. We can see a good example in the book of Daniel, which was written exactly around this time. Daniel was one of those people who had gone into exile, and he maintained his relationship with God. He carried on praying even when they passed a law saying you shouldn't pray to gods other than ours. And best of all, he got involved in the civil service in Babylonia, an excellent example, speaking as a civil servant. It's suggested as well that around this time is the development of the synagogue in Jewish practice. You know that Jewish people worship in synagogues. They didn't have that before, going back to the time of Solomon, they had to worship in the temple. The temple was the focus of their festivals and their sacrifices. But that was destroyed. So what do you do? So firstly, they started to worship just in their own houses, the ones that Jeremiah told them to build. And then they developed the system of synagogues, so they had a place to meet together and teach and worship together. So despite the disruption of the temple being destroyed, they found a way to maintain both their personal and their corporate worship. We're maybe a little bit like that with COVID and lockdown. We have to do things in a different way. We've had times when we've not been able to meet here and everything has to be online. Now we're live streaming our services. Some people are watching on YouTube. We have our prayer meetings on Zoom. We have to find ways to maintain our common worship and share together. So that's important both to us as individuals and to us as a church. The good thing about seeking to maintain our relationship with God, I've got it. It's died on me. Oh. Sorry. There. Is that God still loved them and wanted to have a relationship with them. He's waiting for them. As the passage puts it in verse 12, then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. That's about the relationship God wants with them. He's like the father in the story of the prodigal son, waiting for his people to come back to him. So, question for us in our day, what are we doing to maintain our worship individually and corporately, and our relationship with the God who wants to have a relationship with us? And I can get to it. Can you read that on that water? That's my daughter Katie's water bottle. And it's got verse 11 on it. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So maybe it will be good. She's got that so she can help memorize the verse. Can we say that together and learn it as a memory verse? Say after me. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And God's promise to us is you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. So just, if it works, those are the key things for resilience. Make the best of their situation. Make the best of their relationship with the people around them. Don't wait until the situation is different. Looking at the present and the future is better than looking back to the past with regrets. Have a purpose, hope, put their faith in what God says, and maintain their worship and relationship with God. I've asked quite a lot of questions today, or given you some questions to think about. If anyone wants to do that, I suggest discuss it in life groups, or if you want to do come and talk to me or one of the other leaders here, especially if you have experience and you're feeling in need of resilience yourself at this time. Let's just pray quickly, and then I'll hand back to Steve for the last song. Lord, thank you that you supported your people even though they had gone into exile. Thank you that you wanted to maintain your relationship with them. Thank you that you wrote to them through Jeremiah about how they could be resilient there. Help us learn, Lord, in our own situation to put our trust in you and to have the resilience that we need to cope with the issues of our day. Amen.